I was out fishing this one time on a lake with a bunch of buddies of mine, and they were catching all the fish. Literally, buddy on my left, buddy on my right. They're reeling them in faster than I can count, and the trout are just ignoring my flies. Now, this is not one of my proudest moments, okay? But I got so upset. I started yelling and making a scene. I ended up throwing my fly rod into the lake and stomping back to camp like a 2-year-old. I was more upset than a Karen at an HOA meeting, and I made just as big a fool of myself. Now, if you don't want to find yourself in a situation like that, and I could understand why, then you might want to keep on listening to this show because I'm going to dish on some can't miss info on how to catch trout from lakes. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Company. Okay, I promise I'm not cheating on Coke. It's been a week and I needed the hard stuff. So I got my Mountain Dew Code Red here, the 1 liter bottle too. I ain't messing around. Man, takes me right back. Childhood. Well, that takes me back to. Man, that is good. Code Red's a criminally underrated Mountain Dew flavor. I'm a little bit of a Mountain Dew connoisseur, so I'd love to have some Mountain Dew chats with all y'all on Instagram at some point. So if you're ever interested in chatting about the best flavors of Mountain Dew, hit me up. But anyways, this is not a Mountain Dew show. This is a fly fishing show. This is Untangled, and I'm your host, Spencer Durrant. We got a wonderful little program lined up for you today. See, and I didn't call it great. I called it wonderful this time. So I'm switching up my adjectives a little bit. No, I think this is going to be a fun one, though, that we're going to get into. We're going to be talking a few casting tips, a few general casting tips, using lights at night when you're trying to catch fish at night, wading staffs, catching trout from lakes, and then fishing for trout after you've been catching bass your whole life. So a pretty good mix of topics and some pretty interesting questions as well. I really appreciate everybody that takes the time to write in, and you throw some jokes in there or whatnot. It warms my heart. This is what it does. It's fun. That's one of the, that's one of the really fun parts about doing this show is just getting to interact with everybody. So on that note, please do not hesitate. Send in your questions. I always need more to go through. I really, really love answering these from you folks. So there's always a link in the podcast description to submit your questions there. Do our best to get them answered here on the show. And if you could, if it ain't too much to ask, please go ahead and rate the show wherever you're listening to it. Spotify, Apple Podcasts. If you're listening to this via the Carrier Pigeon Network. Wherever you're listening to it, give it a rating. All right, review it a little bit. Let folks know you enjoy it. And if you don't enjoy it, let me know. We'll work something out. All right. No, I appreciate it, folks. Thanks for everybody who takes time to rate and review and follow the show. We're going to kick things off here with a couple of short questions, a pair of short questions, a couple of interesting ones here. Marvin from Missouri writes in, and his first one, he says, "Love your show, always learning something. For the most part, I do okay in my casting, but every now and then I will end up with the leader and fly slapping the fly rod. What a mess. Wind is not a relative factor. I do notice that it happens more later in the day when I seem to be getting a little tired and maybe not paying as much attention as I should. It is a little frustrating. By the way, I'm sitting at a 12-foot flat-bottom boat fishing for bluegill. Thanks for your insight." Well, Marvin, thank you. Appreciate that you enjoy the show, that you feel like you're learning something. And I really hope that your bluegill fishing went well, too. That would be a bummer if it didn't. I haven't been out fishing for bluegill in longer than I want to admit. It is a lot of fun. If you've never fly fished for bluegill, give it a try. Panfish in general are just a lot of fun, I think, especially on a fly rod, like a little 3-weight. They're fun. They're not too technical either. And there's a pond like 15 minutes west of me. I've been to it once, and it was so windy, I didn't even bother fishing. I just drove out there and looked at it and was like, that's pretty windy. I turned around and went home. I don't know why I did that. So I need to get off my butt and get out there and fish it. But anyways, back to your question here, Marvin. What you're describing sounds an awful lot like you're just getting tired and you're not waiting long enough on your back cast. So if you force that cast forward too quickly, then yeah, you are going to end up slapping the rod with your fly line and your leader. And you want to be careful with this because I actually broke a fly rod that way. I was fishing a pretty big mouse on a 5-weight. Way bigger of a fly than I should have been using with a 5-weight, but that's all I had. And I pushed that back cast forward too soon, and that mouse just whistled forward and smacked the tip of the fly rod and shattered it. So yeah, it can happen. You want to be aware of that so you're not busting your rods. I mean, most of us probably have a backup rod, and warranty and repair processes are pretty good, but it's still, you don't want to bust a rod. So keep an eye out for that, Marvin. Let us know how the bluegill fishing went. Thanks a bunch. Our next question, short one to start things off. Larry from Michigan writes in. Larry says, I fish at night during the summer for big brown trout, usually with a guide. I keep my white light sources to a minimum while on the water, and have actually had good success right after shining a casting spot. Some other fishermen on the river scream, turn off the light, even if it's my visor light I have on while tying a fly or not. A lot of fishermen believe white light spooks a fish, but in my experience, it doesn't. What do you think? Well, Larry, I think you stumbled onto a pretty good question here. I've fished at night for big browns a couple of times. I'm certainly not an expert, and I'm too much of a wuss to stay up all night anymore. I'm getting too old for that stuff these days. But the guys that I learned from, that I went out and did this with, they're phenomenal at this. They regularly are tying into 30-inch browns every season at night on big mouse patterns. So they know what they're doing. And they only used red lights because the theory is that the trout can't see the red light, like the frequency doesn't penetrate the water, or it doesn't spook them the way the white light does. And those red lights is what we would use if we were tying new flies on, or if we were walking from one spot on the bank to another. Just flip the red light on and walk. Took some getting used to, but that's what they used. And like I said, since they're so good at it, I'm kind of gonna follow their lead on things. So that's my 2 cents, is maybe just switch to that red light and see how it works for you. But again, if you're with a guide and things are successful for you, then if the guide's not saying anything to you about it, you're probably okay. Most guides are pretty good about teaching river etiquette. So if it was a huge problem, I think he'd probably say something. But that's just my 2 cents on it. So really interesting question. And if anybody has anything to say about that, I'd love to hear it. Leave some comments, get out to us on social media, however you want to get a hold of us. Be fun to hear from folks who do more night fishing than I do. Now let's get down to the business of the main part of the show here. And thanks, as always, to the folks who send in those shorter questions. Great way to start the show off. I'm actually thinking maybe switching the show format up just a tiny bit, thinking of doing a new segment at the beginning. I'm tentatively going to call it Spencer's Soapbox, where I can get on and pontificate about a subject. So we'll see if that happens. See if it passes the brain trust here at VFC. They keep me on a pretty short leash. I guess I'm a little bit of a loose cannon. No, I'm only a loose cannon when there's wings involved. All right. And speaking of wings, I've had wings in like a week-ish, 6 days. I don't know. It's been a minute. All right. I need to go get me some wings. Anyways, again, this is a fishing show. Let me get back to this. All right. Tommy from North Carolina. He's going to kick us off. He writes in and says, first, I'd like to thank you guys for the ultimate fly collection that I won. Still cheesing. Second, statistically, Coke Zero is taking more of the market each year. Continue to rise up, my Coke Zero friends, and overwhelm the bourgeoisie. Finally, I recently had a surgery that is going to require me, I think, to start using a walking stick while on water. Could you do a segment on their use? The whole spiel. Thanks so much. Tommy, seriously, dude, thanks for that question. That was awesome. I sent that to Alex and Berkeley, and their reactions, they were just dying. That was a great question. We really appreciate it. And, like I said, I've got the hard stuff. I got my Mountain Dew Code Red today, so it's turning. I'm like paranoid now that it's turning my lips and tongue red, like a little kid who just had a snow cone or a popsicle. So if I look like a 12-year-old again, granted, a 12-year-old with a magnificent beard, don't hold it against me, is what I'm trying to say. Oh, well, Tommy, back to your question. I hope you're healing well from surgery. And waiting staffs, this is a pretty interesting topic. I've never really dealt with them too much. I don't do a ton of waiting that would require a waiting staff. A lot of the stuff I'm waiting is smaller streams and whatnot. So it's just never really been on my radar. But I went searching for a little bit of information. I talked to a few folks as well who use them. So did some reading, did some chatting with some folks I know. And a lot of the best info I found was from Dom Swintoski over at Trout. And he wrote a wonderful piece all about waiting staffs. And I've gone ahead and linked that in the podcast description. So you can check that out once you're done with the show here. Because certainly listen to 100% of the show first, right? Anyways, general gist of it here. Waiting staffs are really useful in faster, deeper water, especially if that stream has a rockier bottom that could shift a lot underneath you. A waiting staff gives you, it gives you that extra point of contact on the riverbed. That's never a bad thing. And in Dom's article that he put together about it, he actually said that it helps him wade faster too, which I thought was really interesting. Again, I've never personally used one, but I know folks who do. And hearing that from Dom was pretty interesting. Now, it seems like looking through all the options, and again, this is what Dom recommends at Trout Bitten as well. You want a collapsible waiting staff. It lets you stow it out of the way when you're not using it so that the chances of it tangling your fly line or snagging on a branch or just being a nuisance, they're lessened a lot if you've got it collapsible and kind of out of the way. Dom also recommends hooking it up to like a gear retractor and hooking that to the wading belt under waders. I think that's actually a really good idea. So little things like that can make this tool a lot more practical, a lot more useful if you find ways to lessen the pain in the butt that it can be sometimes. It's funny when you have to talk about like, this tool is great, but you got to do more work than the tool is actually worth. I don't think waiting staffs are quite there. It's just funny. Tools get that way sometimes. But basically, what you're getting from a waiting staff, you're getting extra traction. And it's the same concept of when you have trekking poles, for example, and you're out backpacking. The difference it makes is like night and day because it takes a little bit of the strain off of your shoulders and your waist and helps climbing up and going down steep stuff. I backpacked for years without them because I thought only old people used them. And then one of my buddies, Hiram Weaver, shout out to him. He's at High on the Fly on Instagram. He's got some great stuff. He turned me on to trekking poles during a Wind River backpacking trip a couple of years ago and been a complete game changer for me. So I bet waiting staffs are probably going to be similar for a lot of us. It's going to kind of change your waiting game quite a bit. So hopefully that answered all your questions, Tommy. If you've got any more, you obviously know where to get a hold of us here. Thanks a bunch. Next question comes to us, Brandon from North Idaho. He writes in and says, first off, thank you for making this podcast. As a very new fly fisherman, this show has answered a lot of the questions that I've had. Now to my question. I have been fishing a small stocked lake every couple of days for the past few weeks since I started. It's fairly shallow, 34 feet at the deepest, but most trout are caught fairly shallow. I seem to be able to catch bluegill and sunfish all day long, but can't seem to hook into any trout. I'm fishing a dry dropper rig almost exclusively. What tips do you have for a new fly angler on getting into their first lake-based trout thank you again, and please keep up the good work with the show. Brandon, thank you for the kind words. I really do appreciate that. And congrats on getting started. Your bank account is never going to be the same. So just prepare yourself for a life of poverty, unless you're one of them doctors or lawyers or such who decides to fly fish. And then, you can lord your fancy stuff over to the rest of us. Not that I'm bitter or anything like that. No, I kid. Or seriously, congrats on getting started. Now, this is the question that I teased, obviously, in the hook of the show, the big, I was out on the lake and I had my big blow up and I threw the rod out there. I made such an idiot out of myself. Oh, I still shake my head and just kind of I feel like such an idiot for that. It was one of the most embarrassing moments of my life that I lost it that badly over a stupid fish or lack of a fish, but still, I'd like to think I've mellowed out since that happened. Maybe I haven't, but I certainly hope that I have. Now, to answer your question, Braden, I'm going to make a few assumptions based on what you've said. First off, it sounds like you're fishing from shore, and it sounds like you're maybe fishing during the middle of the day. Just from what I gather, this kind of sounds like a lunch break fishing spot type thing. If you're there that often, if not, you can go to the lake 3-4 times a week. That's awesome. Keep that up, man. I ask these questions because during dawn and dusk, you should be able to see the trout and cast to them as they're rising for like the morning and the evening hatches. So I would assume if you're not able to do that, they're either out further than you can cast, which is very normal. A lot of trout will rise out further than you can cast with a fly rod from shore. So you should be able to see the trout, kind of cast them with their dry fly. Now, if you are catching bluegill and sunfish like almost exclusively, then that makes me think that your dropper, because you say you're fishing that dry dropper rig, is probably at the right depth for just those fish, and those fish are probably beating the trout to eating your flies. Excuse me. And on top of all that, if you're fishing this from shore, you're probably casting like right into the sweet spot of the sunfish's habitat as well. That's something that you'll see on a fair number of lakes that have the sunfish, is they kind of stake their claim in certain zones, and then the trout will stake their claim. I know Fish Lake back in Utah, one of my favorite places on the planet, beautiful little lake. It is renowned for its enormous population of perch. And you can go out there and fish. There's a big weed line that goes right around the lake, and you can just fish right above the weed line and catch more perch than you know what to do with. Or if you get out like 10 feet past the weed line, you're into trout. So it sounds like your lake's kind of set up pretty similarly, where there's a whole bunch of sunfish in close, and then the trout might be out just a little bit further. With all of that stuff in mind, I want to walk you through a few of the things that I've learned about fishing for trout in lakes. This is all stuff I learned after that disastrous lake trip where I chucked my rod in the lake. And thankfully, my buddy Hiram Weaver, I was with him again, High on the Fly on Instagram, he grabbed the rod for me. He fished it out of the lake and brought it back to me. He's a real friend. That guy is, he's one of the good ones. Okay. He brought that back to me. He took care of me a whole heck of a lot more than I deserved. I'll tell you that. Well, I learned all these things after that disastrous trip. I learned a couple of them from Hiram. He's a wonderful teacher, and I learned a lot about fly fishing from him. But really, there's 3 main things that I want you to remember when you're fishing a lake for trout. That would be structure matters. You need to chunk it up, and your flies matter. Now, I'm going to go into each of those in detail, all right? First off, let's talk structure, okay? Just like you know how you need to look for structure in rivers and creeks, you want to look for that same structure in lakes and ponds. Now, it does not have to be the same kind of structure that you look for in a river or a creek. Obviously, it's going to look different in a lake anyways, because lake water is not moving in the same way a river is. But structure can be anything from like our very obvious rocks and boulders to maybe sort of the less obvious drop-offs. Points where the shoreline juts out into the lake are another great piece of structure, because any fish that are cruising the edges of the lake, they have to go around that point. It's also important to remember that the topography around you doesn't change at the water's edge. As an example, I was at this lake fishing for golden trout a while ago somewhere. I'll keep the location a little bit of a secret because we got into them. So I was out fishing for golden trout, and there was this cliff. I was standing a little ways away from the cliff, but from where I stood on the shore, it looked like the cliff just kind of stopped right at the water's edge. So I didn't really cast around it because the angle of the light and everything, it looked like the cliff stopped and the lake was kind of shallow right there. Well, I kept fishing. I made my way towards that cliff, and I get over there, and sure enough, the cliff just keeps going straight down. Because again, the topography is not going to change drastically. The cliff just goes straight down, and holding along the edge of that cliff in the deep water, in the shadow, a whole bunch of golden trout. And I caught more out of that spot than anywhere else around the lake. It was really kind of interesting how that worked out. So if you're struggling to find structure in the water, do yourself a favor, look around you, look around the shoreline, see what the overall topography looks like, and then maybe that'll lead you to something, right? You need some situational awareness, like a ninja, a ninja. I like that. We'll stick with that, like a ninja, right? Ninjas are aware of their surroundings, aren't they? I hope. Another example of how to use structure. I was at this little lake catching some grayling, and it's a wonderful little lake. Really interesting too. It's at like the top of a mountain, and most lakes aren't on the top. They're in like a little bowl or a cirque, right? This one's at the top for whatever reason. Well, there's a whole bunch of tree stumps in one end of the lake, almost like they got cut. And I'm not sure if this lake was man-made or natural. It might have been dammed up at some point. I don't know. I just know there were grayling in it, and I love grayling, so I was up there fishing it. But all these tree stumps are like 3-4 feet deep. Water's crystal clear. And you could just watch the grayling just swim in between the stumps, just la 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 la, like they're slaloming down the mountain, having a great little time. And you could just sit there from shore and just cast out in between the tree stumps and just twitch, little nymphs and whatnot. And the grayling come out and smack it like they owe them money. So it was a lot of fun, a lot of good fishing. And that's another example of how structure can work to your benefit. You find it, the fish want structure, they need it. It helps them feel like they're safe. It gives them like an ambush point at sometimes. Drop-offs are especially very, very good if you get to a place where the water or the lake bed just drops very suddenly. Fish love to hang out on that drop-off line. So look for that structure. Take the time to really analyze where you're at. It's going to pay off. Now, let's move on to the second point, which was chunking it up. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's actually pretty simple. A lot of anglers get intimidated when they look at a lake for the same reason that we get intimidated when we look at a really big river. You look at it and you're like, well, where do I even start? It's so big. It's like the first time you get a king-size candy bar as a little kid. You can't believe it. It's enormous. You don't know where to start. Are you even going to be able to finish it? Are you going to go into a sugar coma like your mom keeps telling you? If you eat that much sugar, your teeth are going to fall out of your head. And then you think, nah, they can't fall out of my head. And you stuff your face and then you throw up. And that, that might happen too when you're an adult, not just a kid either. No, it's easy to get intimidated by this big water, right? Well, the same thing that you would do on a big river where you chunk it up and you're like, okay, I need to find a riffle, or I need to find a seam, or I need to find a pocket. Those same steps that you walk yourself through on a river, do the same thing on a lake. Chunk it up. Don't try to fish it all at once. Don't even try to analyze the whole thing at once. Look at the section of shore that you're on, fish it as well as you can, and then move on to the next section. As an example, there is this high mountain lake that I really like to fish. I took Alex and Berkeley here. Was it last spring or fall? Can't remember. It was sometime. It was warm enough to camp. I know that because we camped. And I took Alex in Berkeley here. Wonderful little spot. We actually, I think it was the trip that Berkeley's car decided to quit doing car things, which is not good. Anyways, we were out on this little lake, and each section of shoreline's really distinct. Like there's this one section where you're right near a bunch of rocks and logs, and then there's another section that puts you within casting distance of a big drop off. And then there's another section where it kind of juts out into a point. And it's nice because it's like the lake chunked itself up for me. And part of that's just because I know the lake well enough. I've fished it a lot. So I know like what I'm looking for, and that's kind of how familiar you want to get with the lakes that you're going to go fish. Chunk them up into those little bite-sized pieces, just like this big lake up in the mountains that I do. It becomes a lot more manageable when you do that. And finally, flies really do matter, especially for trout. While a lot of trout are going to take the same flies in a lake that you use in the river, things like zebra midges, hare's ears, pheasant tails, I do like to have a good selection of medium-sized streamers, a bunch of micro leeches, and chironomids, a micro leech chironomid rig underneath an indicator. That's my go-to rig on lakes, unless they're actively hitting the surface on something, or I know that there's a nymph going on, that they're like damselfly nymphs, for example, that I know they're keyed in on. Then I'll fish those. But that micro leech chironomid rig rarely lets me down. Also, I wouldn't be caught out on a lake without scuds either. Scuds are like a magic weapon. Man, they are so good out there. So those are your 3 tips, right? Structure matters. Chunk it up. Your flies matter. Make sure you've got a good selection of flies. Don't try to fish the whole lake at once. Make sure you're fishing near structure. I think if you do those things, Braden, you're going to find that you're going to get into those trout out on that lake of yours. So thanks for the question. Really do appreciate it. All right. The last question for today's show comes to us from Chad from Tennessee. Chad writes in and says, I started listening to your podcast on the way back from a 3-day trip I took to the Smoky Mountain National Park. I'm a bass fisherman with a fly rod, and I found out that my bass fishing experience meant nothing when it came to fishing for trout. I wish that I listened to you before my trip. I did catch 2 rainbows on the last spot I hit, and it made it all worth it. What tips do you have for bass fishermen like me who want to be successful when fishing for trout? Love the show, and thanks for everything you do. P.S. Diet Coke. Chad, you're 100% right about Diet Coke, unless, of course, it's Mountain Dew Code Red. And I mean, if Mountain Dew wants to sponsor the show instead of Coke, I could totally get behind that. All right. So if there's any Mountain Dew execs listening, then you need to reach out. Spencer Durrant, Untangled Podcast. Send it via Pony Express. They know how to get in touch with me. So, Chad, I wouldn't say that bass fishing experience doesn't translate at all to catching trout. In my experience, some of the best trout anglers I know are also really good bass anglers. In fact, one of my best friends, who is probably the fishiest trout guy I know, Ryan Kelly, he, wonderful trout angler, catches bass all the time. Really good at catching smallmouth. Bass fishing can teach you a ton about fishing streamers. Like the correct depth and the speed, and that stuff translates to trout fishing really, really well. It's kind of like Spanish and Portuguese, right? There's enough similarities there. And speaking of Portuguese, growing up, there's this family in the neighborhood. They had an exchange student from Brazil, and I met the exchange student from Brazil, and they introduced me to her. And I think I was 14 or 15 at the time, so don't judge me too much. But they introduced me to her, and I looked at her and I said, "Hola," thinking I was this multicultural hero, right? And they're like, "Why are you saying that to her? She doesn't speak Spanish." I'm like, "What do you mean she doesn't speak Spanish? She's from Brazil. They speak Spanish in Brazil." "No, they don't. It's not Spanish in Brazil." "Well, what is it? Brazilian?" "No, it was Portuguese." All right, but I'm an idiot and didn't know that. Oh, anyways, back to the fly fishing question here. In my experience, there's like three main differences between trout and bass fishing that I think are important to consider. And before we get into these, I'm not trying to turn this into a contest between what's better, trout or bass. I love them both. They're both fun to fish for. I don't have anything at bass. I'm not interested in making any kind of argument. Right? These are just things that I've gathered. That's the word that I wanted to say. I've noticed from my trout and my bass fishing that I've done. Three things. Number one, trout are pickier about the fly than bass. They care about the pattern itself a lot more. Number two, trout also care a bit more about the presentation. All right, and I'll get into that in a minute. And number three, trout flies will often be a lot smaller than the stuff that you use for bass. So let's kind of go into this in a little bit of detail here. First point, trout are pickier about the fly than bass. Trout really do key in on certain hatches. When there's a mayfly coming off, they want that mayfly, but it gets even more like in the weeds than that. They don't want just the mayfly. They want a specific version of the mayfly. I was out fishing with Alex in Berkeley a couple weeks ago, and we got into a wonderful blue wing hatch. But those fish, almost from the get-go, they did not want the adult version or the dun, right? We call the adults the duns. They didn't want that. They wanted the emerger version, which is the mayfly as it's kind of stuck in the surface film, emerging from its nymph form into its dry fly form. Its wings are kind of popping out. It's struggling in the surface film. It's an easier target. It requires a little bit less work from the trout to snag it than the dun does. They're just an easier target. And these fish wanted that. They did not want the adult. They wanted the emerger. So you will find hatches like that where the trout just key in on things. And it can be maddening sometimes. Bass fishing is rarely like that. Now, the presentation part of this, as far as that goes, trout will get very line and leader shy, where bass usually don't. I mean, you could throw, 10-pound braid when you're fishing for bass. It doesn't matter. Fish sees that, or a trout sees that on the surface. Trout's going to spook and hide off and tell all its friends. You're never going to catch that fish. All right. It's like the girl at the party that you try the pickup line on and it fails. And then she tells all her friends and then none of them talk to you. And then you go home by yourself. Anyways, I usually go with like 4X leader when I'm fishing for trout. That's my starting point. Sometimes they will require a lot thinner line than that. Again, same fishing trip with Alex in Berkeley a few weeks ago. We got into a wonderful little spinner fall right at the end of the day. That's when all like the dead adults are kind of spinning back down to the water surface and the trout were just gorging on all these dead bugs. And I could not get them to rise to my fly. They were eating everything but my fly. And I was getting a little angry. I wasn't all the way to throwing my rod in the river, but I could see that. That was a potential if I didn't get my crap under control. Well, I ended up having to go all the way down to 7X tippet. They were that leader shy. Once I tied that on, it didn't spook them. There was no drag on the fly, and they finally started eating. You rarely have to get like that fine and delicate with your lines with bass the way that you'd have to do with trout. And finally, trout flies are usually a lot smaller than bass flies because trout are usually keyed in on those tiny insects. So you're going to find yourself using a lot of like size 16, size 18 type stuff with trout. Whereas with bass, flies that smaller, I don't want to say useless, but certainly not the go-to. I caught a pretty good smallmouth. I think it was like 15 or 16 inches on like a size 10 micro leech once. And that was not expected. That was just all I had. And I happened to get into some smallmouth fishing. So it was kind of one of those opportunities that you just take and go with it. But usually you're not going to use flies that small. So hopefully that's helpful to you, Chad. And if you had any more questions about that, please don't hesitate to reach out. Let us know. And with that, folks, we're going to end this week's show. Appreciate it. As always, if you have any questions about fly fishing that you'd like answered, please do not hesitate to write in. There's always a link in the podcast description. I'd love to answer your questions. It's tons of fun doing the show, and I know I say that every week, but it really is. I have a lot of fun doing this, and I hope y'all are enjoying it as much as I am. And until next week, get out on the water and tight lines, everybody.